Welcome to the American Family Association Presents. Tonight's topic is we're going to take a look at school choice in education in the state of New York. Currently, the issue of school choice is gaining in legislatures in more states across the nation, but not in New York. Choice in education typically involves state-funded scholarships or tax credits, always set at levels well below the cost of a public school education, so not only do parents get to choose their child's school, but taxpayers also win. It often begins by allowing low-income students to shift from failing public schools to attend private, usually religious schools. School choice is our topic tonight. Our guests with opposing views are Santo Albano and Frank Russo. Santo Albano is a licensed psychologist who attended both public and private schools. Before working as a geropsychologist serving seniors in nursing homes, Santo worked for over 30 years at SUNY Stony Brook. His wife Judy spent over 30 years as a public school teacher. Santo opposes using public funds to provide choice in education. Our other guest tonight is Frank Russo, who is a former division manager with AT&T and Verizon and serves on the executive committees of Long Island for Educational Reform and the Nassau Conservative Party. Frank is also president of the Port Washington Educational Assembly and is married with 7 children and 28 grandchildren and supports school choice. We welcome our guest. And now my co-host, Patty Knapp.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome again to both of you. Let's start with the basic reasons that each of you support or oppose school choice, parents having the right to use their school tax credits or state-funded scholarships for their child's education. Santo, we'll start with you.
Okay. I'm going to put aside for a moment the whole issue of whether framing it as a school choice issue is the appropriate thing to do. But I'll indicate basically this. I'm concerned about vouchers leading to not only a decline in the public school system, but also in a decline in the private religious school community. Because I believe that the way the private religious community has fashioned their schools serves their intent in terms of their values and what they want to give to their children. And it's been my experience that anytime public tax money flows into any institution, there's always a fly in the ointment, and that it changes those institutions that receive that money, because tax dollars going to the public school system are there to fulfill the mission of the public school system, which is not the same mission that you'll get in private schools, but I'll elaborate on that later.
We'll go into a lot more detail. And Frank, your response?
Basically, there are 3 reasons and 3 constituent groups that I think would benefit with school choice. Those 3 constituent groups are the students, second are the taxpayers, third are the parents. Students will benefit because in America and most of Western civilization, competition is good. Competition tends to improve things for everybody. When you have a monopoly, that's not the case. And so competition will help the students, because if the schools are not good, the kids are going to go into different schools. The parents will take them out and put them into different schools that will perform the mission the parents want. Second are the taxpayers. Since every voucher program sets the voucher or scholarship or tax credit at a fraction of the public school cost, generally half or less, that means the taxpayers win, because you're going to have a savings. Initially, the savings will be low, and as time goes on, there's an economic principle that every economist buys. In the long term, all costs are variable, and so you will have a significant savings for taxpayers with a school choice program setting the aid to the parent at a level half or less than the public school cost. And third, parents benefit, because parents now will be free to choose the kind of climate, whether they want a certain dress code, a certain attitude with regard to saying a prayer before meals, whether they want a certain form of behavior encouraged or discouraged. The parent now will have a way to reaffirm his or her moral principles on key social issues which the public schools address in simply one uniform way.
Okay, you raised some good points. Now, Santo, what do you feel would be the fiscal impact on taxpayers in your view?
Well, I'm going to partly defer. I'm going to give you my opinion, but I want to qualify it by saying I'm not an economist, and I don't really have the background that Frank has. And getting into the details of the finances. As a matter of fact, I'm interested in hearing how he talks about the details about how it's going to work. As a reaction to some of what Frank said, I would only put in front of, the students, the parents, the taxpayers. Some students will benefit. Some parents will benefit, because I think vouchers are not the panacea that they're being promoted to be. Because at least in the beginning, as Frank indicates, the vouchers will not cover the cost of a parochial school. It's much lower. Then you add into selective admissions. So you'll have a lot of taxpayers who are thinking they're going to get their religious education, discover that they still can't afford parochial schools because the amount they're given falls far short of what it costs. In preparation for today's discussion, I first of all couldn't find any kind of general document. Frank may know whether it exists or not, but I couldn't find it that would give me an average cost for parochial schools in New York State. So I asked those friends and colleagues of mine who send their kids to parochial schools, and I'm not going to name the various names, but about 4 or 5 on the island, and I get approximately $8,000 to $9,000 a year. And I don't think the first era of tax vouchers are going to be $9,000. So there are going to be a lot of people who think they're going into a religious-based school where they'll get better writing, reading, and arithmetic, but they're not going to get in. That's on the finances alone. They're also not going to get in if they have a history of being a discipline problem in the public schools. They're not going to get in the private schools necessarily if they have some disability, because the private schools are very good at selecting those difficult students out. The public schools, by the mandate of the Constitution, open admission. Their responsibility is to educate all children, not the cream of the crop or the selected out.
Okay, Santa got off onto a lot of diversionary issues that I think we're going to get onto some of the other questions. He made one erroneous statement when he said that the voucher amounts that I'm calling for are less than the private school tuition costs. Again, understand that 90% of all private schools are religious schools. There are ritzy private schools. 5 to 10% are ritzy private schools, and they have costs comparable to, even higher than, public schools. But the 90% of the private schools that are religious all have costs in New York State that are well below half the cost of the public schools. In other states, I should point out, it's not that case. In those states, private school costs are more typically maybe 60 to 70%, or even 75% of the public school costs, but not in New York State. In New York State, they range from, believe it or not, as low as 25% to maybe 40% of public school costs. An example, in Long Island, and I'm very familiar with private school costs, and yes, as Sano said, I did do this professionally for Verizon, AT&T, and New York Telephone. I did cost studies. I was in charge of that for those companies for many years. The tuition, the costs that the private schools in Long Island, the religious schools, for elementary school, and this is including the aid we get from the public schools for transportation, it's including the subsidy you get from the parish. You have to include the total, all this, plus the tuition to get to the real cost. It's perhaps $5,500, $6,000. The public school cost today in Long Island is about $20,000. If you take out special needs kids, I'd say it's more like $18,000. Many private schools now in our community in Port Washington, it's $24,000 per pupil, but say on the average about $21,000. When you take out special needs costs, about $18,000. But the private schools, the elementary schools, are doing it for about a third of the cost. High schools would be higher. They'd be perhaps in the order of $8,500, maybe 40% or 42%, something in that order. I'm suggesting that the vouchers start at a low level, that they get phased in on 2 bases. You start them at maybe 20% or 25% of public school costs, and you gradually, over a 5 to 8 year or 10-year period, you raise them to perhaps as high as 70%, no higher than that, of the public school cost, absent special needs costs, excluding special needs costs. So in that case, you're assuring that in the long run, during which period of time all costs are avoidable. In the short run, you can't avoid certain costs. You can't avoid certain building costs for public schools. But in an intermediate term, 4 or 5 year period, you can close down certain public schools, sell them to private institutions or charter schools. So in that case, those costs then, with maintenance and principals and secretaries and so forth, those costs can also be avoidable. In the short run, it's basically teacher costs that are avoidable. So, was there any work ever done on this? Yes. Back in 1991, believe it or not, there was a commission established by the New York State Senate, headed by Ron Lauder, Veste Lauder. It was called a study on privatization. They were looking at airports and railroads and all sorts of things. And they looked at ways that the state of New York could save money. And boy, now in this fiscal crisis, there's never been a more appropriate time to do that. Of all the things they found, the one that stood out and amounted to the biggest amount of savings was in education. By the way, they printed their findings, in full-page ads in the New York Times in November of '91, in Newsday. They publicized their findings for the New York State Senate.
Now, to be fair, that's many years ago. That's
Yes.
15 or 16 years ago. But in your analysis,
18 years ago,
18
yeah.
years ago, your belief is that many of those findings would still be true today, correct?
Well,
that the
they're
assumptions
different
that
in one
drove them-
respect. They found, back in '91, Mike, they found the savings with a full parental choice system in New York State alone for the taxpayers would be $4 billion per year. My estimation now, say for the year 2010, would be in the order of $10 billion per year in savings with a fully implemented voucher program.
Unbelievable.
It is mind-boggling.
Now, that leads me into the next question, which is, so help us understand where the funding would come from. Is that from the federal, from the state, or from local property taxes?
That's a good question, and I know Santa has asked me this. It would come mostly from state and local. I would say 90%, because the federal government's business is not really education. A little bit today, they provide aid for colleges in terms of tax credits and so forth. I'd like to see the same thing done. Senator Schumer has proposed increasing the tax credits for college tuition. I wrote him a letter. What about including K-12? This would benefit all taxpayers across all 50 states because it might facilitate parents taking their kids out of these very expensive public schools and putting them into these much lower cost private religious schools. He fails to answer my question. He gibberish letter back to first. I write him again. He's in a bind because he kowtows to the public school teacher union. Senator Schumer is a nonsensical senator. He doesn't really care about the taxpayers. He cares about the public school teacher unions. So he refused to answer the question, which I made as simply worded as possible. And either his staff person or his, whatever, he gave me an idiot non-answer. Yeah, it should be a tax credit. It should include not only the college tuition, it should include K-12. And keep it low. I would say it all. My main point is that the total amount of all government aid, federal, state, local property tax, should never amount to more than 70%, 75% of the public school cost. And it doesn't get there for the first 5 to 8 years. You start at a low point. I would introduce it to benefit only low-income people at first. Because let's be honest, it's the minorities, the African Americans, the Hispanic students in our failing public schools that are suffering the most today. Everyone knows it. They are the most ones in support of school choice. They want it fiercely. I wish they would vote for candidates for office who would support school choice, but they don't. They vote Democratic, and the Democrats kowtow to the teacher union. So the black people who want school choice are voting for politicians who oppose it because they're afraid of the teacher unions, these politicians. Any case, the way to do it is the fashion I've just described. Make sure that the taxpayers benefit, that the competition comes because you give choice, and if the public schools don't improve, the parents are going to take the kids out. If they do the best job, and by the way, something else Sano said that was erroneous, the Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of New York have been studied to a great degree. They take them from all demographic groups. They have a better measure of integration, racial integration. They come from single-parent homes, and yet they're doing much better with graduation rates and in test results of every nature, math, reading, writing, and sciences.
That's very convincing.
No, Senator, you.
Well, in the public schools, when you do charter schools and you reduce the number of students in the class, and you get the highly motivated poor kids with efficacious families who really sit on them to study, they do well. They do well. So there's no need really to go outside the system. What Frank doesn't lay out is that the public schools that he argues cost on average $20,000 per student have a mission that's very different than the private religious schools, and that mission includes educating every child. And it costs to do that. That's why you got costs for psychologists in public schools, for social workers, all the ancillary care stuff that let's say that group of parochial schools that's not the elite, very expensive, the middle road, often they don't have those costs. And so to me, it's like a false comparison. I see this in another way. You take the public school system of the United States that tries to educate everybody. Then they do a study where they compare the scores on several tests of the public school kids with the kids in London. And they discover the kids in London do better. Well, their system in London is a select out system. You're lucky if you get through high school. 30% of their population that's college age, of the 100% that is college age eligible, they only select in 37%. So you can't, they're always comparing apples and oranges. And so hidden in this comparison of the $20,000 for the public school versus the efficient economic private school, if they were produced, if they had the same responsibilities and were dealing with the same goals, then I think it would be a decent comparison, but it's, again, apples and oranges. Even though the parochial schools do well with certain kinds of kids, I'm a poor Italian. I went to parochial school. I know they were good at regimentation, getting me to wear the uniform, spouting doctrine. And yes, that order created an environment for me to learn. But there's nothing necessary about a parochial school to say that they're the only ones who could create that kind of environment, because if you look at the studies, as well as studies he's going to point out, within the public school system, that when you create a similar environment, which is you select out the kids that are having a hard time, you give them after-school activities that are academically oriented, those kids always tend to be, if they're poor, they tend to have something unique, which not all poor children have, is either some adults in their environment who care about whether they learn. And if they have parents who care, that's like 60% of the job. To the credit of the private school, religious school system, I say, what they got is a whole lot of parents who care. The public school has to educate the ones that come from families they really don't care about education. And we see it, but they have to be taught anyway. Another thing that he doesn't point out, that I believe is part of the public school system, is that it's a unifying experience. We're educating towards democracy. And in democracy, you need everyone to have a critical mind. So that's why we're trying, it's compulsory, and they're trying to educate everybody.
Just to,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, to respond to that, one of the things we've also found in our studies is that once parents make a choice, and we're largely talking about poor parents and at best middle-income parents, when they make the choice to pick a certain school, and we've seen this in Milwaukee and Cleveland and DC, it's amazing how their attitude changes. Suddenly, it's not something that was forced on them, it's something that they chose. So what we've found is that the parental involvement, the parental concern and interest in education increases with choice.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, they get more involved because they're making the choice. It's a natural thing. The mission, now another thing that Santo mentioned, the mission. The public schools, unfortunately today, the mission is, when you look at the system, not the parents or the kids, but the system, it's more focused not on the students, it's focused on the unions, the teacher unions and all the other unions that are robbing the taxpayers, where you have a system where the poorest teacher gets as much pay as the best teacher. You have it locked in by law. You have a tenure system where after 3 years you can't fire a teacher. In New York City, we saw Stupid in America with John Stossel on ABC, in which John Stossel showed us there were 200 to 300 teachers in what they call rubber rooms. These were teachers who were terrible performers, failing their students, or who committed crimes against the students, sometimes serious crimes. But we can't, because of the law up in Albany and the protections given these tenured teachers, it costs us, as they said, $250,000 to $300,000 to get rid of each teacher. It will cost them tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to get rid of them. They put them in the rubber rooms, have to pay them their full salaries, and they're not teaching. The public school system is designed to protect, their primary mission, the way the system is designed, is to protect the unions and the teachers, not the students. Once you give choice, you're empowering the parent. Once you empower the parent is now going to evaluate how well a job that school is doing. And if it's not a good job, that parent is going to remove his or her child and put him into a better school. Competition affects quality in a serious way. The mission is critical. Parents will care more when they make the choice. The mission of the private schools is to educate the children. And the best evidence of that comes from all the studies of the voucher programs and scholarship programs we have. They're increasingly doing better. And they're taking kids not from the upper levels. They're not picking and choosing, as Santa was implying. He's not familiar with these trials and the data. I've been reading this for 30, 40 years. They take the poorest kids, and it's the same demographics, high percentages of single-parent homes. But and you should see the enthusiasm as was shown on Stupid in America. These parents get ecstatic when their number is picked in a lottery. There are so many parents who want the places, they can only give them to 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 parents. So when their name gets picked, that they can go to a private school at half the cost, the ecstasy you see on their face is
Euphoria.
mind-boggling. There's no question about it. So everyone wins with a choice system, except poor teachers are not going to do well. Better teachers would also win, by the way. They'll come out ahead. But mediocre teachers and poor teachers will fare more poorly. We won't have quite as many administrators. And if you ever heard New York City, they have 5,000, 6,000 administrators for the public school system. The Catholic Archdiocese of New York, with 10% of the students, they have 40 administrators, a minuscule percentage relative-wise. So the public schools are wasting our money. They've got a racket going. The politicians are terrified of them. And the victims are the parents, especially low-income and middle-income parents, African-American parents, Hispanic parents, and the taxpayers. We're getting screwed royally.
Well,
Yeah, I think, can I respond?
Sure,
to what
go
you-
ahead.
yeah. I think Frank is an articulate union basher. He's good at it. I actually enjoy it when he does. He puts it together.
Because
so
I'm
well.
right.
Stop stealing my lines. The public school system is large enough and has such a large amount of teachers that you could always go in the system and find some area that's not quite working. The professional unions have done something for the teachers that's quite amazing. The unions got them a living wage. Frank's idea of improvement is to have the private program schools where teachers don't make living wages. So how could that improve anything? The other thing is this, with this choice thing. I wonder if Frank really believes so deeply in choice that at a certain age, let's say at the time your kids could choose to be confirmed into your religion or not, you gave them the choice to choose another religion. Wouldn't choosing another religion make them feel so powerful and empowered? Choice, it's that important. So he's providing a psychological explanation that it makes those parents happy who get selected. Of course, these are people who want to send their kids to religious schools. I have no problem with that. They can do it already. Some of them, because they're poor, they don't have the money to do it with tuition fees and whatnot. Of course they're going to be happy. So I don't think that's an explanation. I think, well, that's the two I'll say on that.
no,
Yeah.
I would just ask if we could pause here because we're at the halfway point in
Sure.
our program. And we're having a provocative discussion tonight on the issue of school choice in the state of New York. We're going to pause here for a public service announcement, and we'll be back in just a minute. Thank you.